Hi, my name is Dan Gomez, and this is Mental Health Supra Omnia. Mental health above all. We identify and understand mental health issues and the paths for help. Today, we want to talk about young adults, ages 18 to 29, and mental health issues from their perspective. We have two guests with us today. First, Lynne Carroll. Lynne is a former psychology professor from the University of North Florida, author of The Parent Pivot, as well as innumerable articles and other books. She has over 30 years in the field, is highly regarded, and is pretending to retire early, both in Florida and in North Carolina. Next, we have Erica Kawamura. Has a doctorate in psychology, PsyD, board certified in lifestyle medicine, brings over 20 years experience, and is part of the Equilibria Psychological and Consultation Services leadership team. She provides therapy to adult clients to help them improve their well-being, lead more fulfilling lives, and work toward their personal goals. Lynne, we have read The Parent Pivot, What to Do When Your Young Adult is in Psychological Distress. Today, we want to explore the topic from the young adult side. We'll look at the parent side at a different date. Can you summarize for us what anxiety and depression look and feel like from the young adult perspective, particularly as opposed to earlier bouts of uncertainty that they may have had?
Gosh, I might even amend what you said a little bit or tweak it. I think the level of uncertainty at this particular age is sort of off the charts. It's a
Okay.
newfound level of uncertainty. And, I think the person who really kind of put this together in my consciousness was a psychologist at Clark University, Jeffrey Arnett. He was the one back in 2000 who coined the term merging adulthood
Mm,
to describe a very distinct developmental stage in life. I think he got us to thinking about this a little bit more seriously and about what all of the, I think, socioeconomic, political, and cultural dynamics, how they were operating on young people at this stage. Because, you know, 18, you're a legal adult.
mm,
And years ago, I think we had a whole different experience of what that meant. And usually there was this kind of lockstep formulaic sense that, you go to school, you find a job, or you go on for higher education beyond high school, um, you meet somebody, you settle down, you buy the house, you have the kids. Um, and I think that now we realize that this isn't the case, that a lot of young people are postponing, sometimes indefinitely,
mhm,
um, finding stability in their lives. They're actively exploring, and I think um, Meg Jay, who just recently published a book called "The 20-Something Treatment," she talks about, this world is just filled with uncertainty. When we were writing the book, we were thinking about it being filled with anxiety and fear,
mm,
and we were thinking about it in the middle of COVID because that's when we started to write the book. And we thought, okay, I had to leave my office, my practice, everything got shut down. And we were thinking, wow, this is really tough. But think about it from the perspective of an emerging adult, a young adult, just beginning to make their way in the world. And they have to come back, and in many cases, come back to their parents' home, and relying upon the finances and the structure of a place they sometimes really are eager to leave. Sometimes, not always. And so, that propelled us into thinking about, the fact that, okay, there's not much attention about this. There wasn't a lot of attention about this particular stage of life, but even more so from the perspective of the parent. And that's what kind of led us to wanting to write the book, The Parent Pivot. And I know we're going to be talking about the young adult, but I wanted to talk a little bit about a case that I had been working with that I found particularly profound and moving, from both sides of the coin. This client that I had, her name was Pam. I'm just going to use a fictitious name and change some of the details to protect her. But she had a 20-year-old son who, seemed to do quite well in his teenage years, got fairly good grades, seemed fairly well adjusted. Um, Freshman year seemed to do okay. But then as time went by, throughout his sophomore and junior year, his grades began um, failing. He was, I think, sort of apathetic and withdrawn, not his usual self. She tried very hard to get him to go to get some help, to talk to somebody at least outside of her and the family, and he refused that. So we're going to fast forward to one evening about 2 o'clock in the morning. The police knocked on the door, pounded on the door, and she and her husband roused themselves out of sound sleep, went downstairs and answered the door, and there were two policewomen, who said that her son, whose name was Eric, that he apparently uh, downed a bottle of pills and I guess got a little bit scared about doing that and called a hotline. And the
Mhm,
hotline sent some police out. Well, Pam and her husband uh, did what they could to get her son some help, and he seemed to get back on track. Well, this was probably months later. She's in my office saying, you know, I in my zeal, my zest to get him help, I didn't realize how much I was suffering and that I needed help. Um, I and I have these reoccurrent and somewhat intrusive thoughts about whether he's going to do it again. And I don't feel safe. I don't. He doesn't. I don't feel he's safe. And I'm supposed to be letting go, but I just feel like I want a helicopter all the time, and I'm irritated. I'm irritated at my husband. I'm just, I've lost myself in this process. So it was very powerful.
mhm,
That particular encounter to me was very powerful because, it points out, how oftentimes uh, not only parents, but friends, um, teachers are unaware of what's happening. If we look at the headlines just recently of that young man who was using chat GBT,
mhm,
for 6 months, and no one, was aware of what was going on, and that he was in such deep despair until a malfunction in the bot and occurred, and that led to a whole other series of issues that I hope we can touch on today. But you know um, young people can go underground, and in terms of being at this age, not only to their parents, but sometimes to their friends, and tap into things um, that are harmful to them and destructive. Um, Even dabbling, into things that are harmful and destructive. And I hope we get to that later. So, you getting back to your question, what does it look like, this anxiety and depression? Um, Sometimes it just looks like immobility, being immobilized, being, apathetic. I think, remember that movie that came out in 2006, Failure to Launch, and then the subsequent book that came out afterwards. Um, it sometimes can just look like that. My kid, my 24-year-old kid is holed up in the basement and won't leave, you know. Um, in England, they call those kippers, the kids whose parents are picking their pockets and eroding their retirement savings. So in all over the world, I think, in Japan, there's a term that's used to describe uh, young adults that seem to be just totally withdrawn um, and apathetic. So it doesn't. I think there's a probably one of the things that I like to really think about with all of this is that any symptom like anxiety and depression is continuum based.
Mhm.
And we talk about disorders, we talk about mental illness. And I think we have a diagnostic manual that tells us what that looks like. But I think it's real hard when you love someone, when you love your child, your adult child, where what does it when it's not so extreme, what does it look like, and when do you really need to worry? When does it become a red flag?
Mhm. Oh, I think you're muted, Dan.
There we go. Erica, you obviously have dealt with adults, perhaps even young adults that have gone through this situation. How do you reflect on that? I mean, obviously there's some differences. If their anxiety and depression is kind of off the charts, what's happening at this point in time, and when is it that they want help, and when is it that they don't want help?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up because, I wanted to touch on, when you talk about the continuum, like in your book, you talk about the continuum of like low functioning to high functioning, and then the as well as the low distress, high distress, and then also the level of impact that it's having on their lives. And um, I think there's so many in it. And I was curious about like if there's any certain tendencies, right? Like to kind of what kind of personalities or again associations. It's not a causation or based on facts per se, but just tendencies and patterns that you tend to see with the ones that are like the high functioning but high distress. And I think that was kind of what your client's son was so leaning toward rather than just like all of that stuff. They're more overt and I think to answer your question, Dan, what what do I see is I think there's a lot of factors that go into it. Like when you were talking about more of the things outside of our control, like COVID, all the socio-political stuff going on. The social media is a huge one. I mean, I'm just so glad I didn't have to deal with that growing up. But that also, erodes on that negative comparison to others and distorted perceptions of assessment of yourself and everything, and then there's also more of like the internal psychological things of the failure to launch pieces of, is it just the motivation, or is there a part where kids are perceptive, so those kids grow up and are now the emerging adults, so do they have like some, whether it's an implicit message or you know, a real concern, where they feel like they need to kind of hang out at home and take care of the parents, because, and that can also be a whole continuum as well, where there is an actual parent that has like mental health issues or substance abuse or abusive tendencies. And then there's also more of the distorted perception where they want the kid to launch and do all these great things, but they feel like, well, mom's going to be lonely or dad's going to be lonely, or I want him to find a partner, or, because maybe they were widowed or divorced. And I just feel like there's like so many different factors that go into it. So it's hard to kind of come up with a hard
Yeah,
and fast,
yes.
um, like why one becomes one way or the other. And I was curious if you had any insights into the ones that tend to not be the burden, stay quiet, right, and suffer
Mhm.
alone, and those that are
Yes.
more expressively, behaviorally doing things to show
Yes.
their distress.
Um, one of the a term that we used a little bit distinctively in our book were the dragons.
Yeah.
You
Hmm.
know, I I think we wanted to get into the imagery of the dragon. Um, and what that is it's looking at substance misuse, internet misuse, uh, unhealthy eating, excessive exercising, risky and impulsive behaviors like reckless driving, sexual acting out. We tend to see these things more in relation to the uncertainty and anxiety factor, the fear factor.
Hmm.
You know,
But hang on, because I'm confused about two things. Okay, you said internet misuse, and then you talked about sexual activity. And when I think about young adults, I think of young adults constantly being on their phone, on their mobile device, internet, etc. Not necessarily talking, but clicking away. So what's the difference between that and internet misuse? That's number one. And number two, when you
mm,
talk about sexual activity, isn't that a time of sexual exploration anyway? So how do you differentiate between normal sexual exploration and an issue, a sexual issue, as you would describe it?
yes, wow, uh, really challenging to make those distinctions. But yes, and very much so. This is a developmental stage that is about exploration and experimentation, and sex and drugs, alcohol, all of that, very much a part of that, just normal exploration. What's normal? I know it's a question. What's normal? But, I think, and there's where we get to, Erica's point about how much of all of that is interfering.
Hmm.
It's all that about functioning and interfering with life. And yes, there are, I think, adults, young adults that, that's not a perfect correlation, distress, um, and functioning. It's not a correlation. Your distress and your functioning is low. You're you're highly distressed and your functioning is low. No. Some young adults are able to function fairly well, and yet I think are really misusing substances and all kinds of things, getting into dangerous situations. So, it's not always a perfect kind of equation, but yet I think it is helpful to look at those things as a parent or a friend or family member. But I think, what we're trying to in the book, what we're trying to suggest is that most of those misuse and addictive behaviors are driven by the level of anxiety and uncertainty that is happening in this population. And if you've read, I think an excellent read is Haidt's book on the anxious generation. Now he's talking about adolescents. We're talking about young adults, but no matter because we're talking about Gen Zs.
Mhm.
Gen Zs are born around 1995 and beyond. So we have we have young adults who are being, according to his work, are being rewired by this experience of growing up with a smartphone in their hands and using this as a substitution for free play, a substitution for face to face interaction, social stimulation with with their peers. And when that happens, there's fragmentation of attention, there's deprivation of sleep, attentional, all the attentional problems in and of themselves are amazing. There's also an addictive quality to, as we know, as the research is telling us about all of the social network experiences and platforms that we have, just about all of them.
And yet
Where
those are designed to be addictive
right,
with the dopamine hits and
right,
all of that.
right.
Yeah.
So, this is a really compelling case because,
Mhm.
basically what to me it's very compelling because what he's saying is that there's this isolationism and loneliness. One of the things that struck me when I was teaching at the university before I retired was, I would be in the dining hall, I would be walking around campus, and students were together, but they were apart. They were walking together, but they were looking at their screens, and they were compulsive. They were texting their friends rather than connecting. In the cafeteria, they were doing the same. We see this with established adults, right? We see this all the time, and how, and his point is how really damaging that is at a time in which the brain is continuing to develop. And one of the things about the decade of the 90s is the tremendous, research, the proliferation of research that we have about the brain, and the realization that from a neurocognitive perspective, things are still happening with the brain, and particularly with the prefrontal cortex till the age of at least 25. Okay. So that means that executive functioning, the ability to sort of problem solve and make decisions that are sometimes based on things that are emotional as well as as intellectual, pulling together and integrating data about your emotional life, your interior life, as well as your thoughts, your sometimes thoughts that you might not even be aware of, automatic types of thoughts or core beliefs that you might have, and using that data to make decisions that are not so impulsive and rashly derived behaviors that are rash and impulsive.
Yeah.
So that stuff is I think really important. It's really important to understand that this is a stage where there's a lot of instability, a lot of exploration, and there's still, despite I think hard economic times and young people who run a spectrum in terms of race, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, all of those things, um, you know, they're they're very much still thinking about the world as a world of possibilities. That no matter what, maybe they're into hard times in the moment, but at some point their world is their oyster, and they're gonna kind of make it through, and so you have all that. I think the point of this is you have all that swirling around. Then on top of that, you have the experience in a VUCA world. And we use that acronym in our book because we felt like it really fit. It's from business management, and it stands for volatility, uncertainty, changeableness, and ambiguity. If you think what happened yesterday, okay, I can't help but be really fueled by emotionally by this. Yesterday with the death and injury of children in church, there is no safe place. We have nightclubs now, we have movie theaters, we have malls, we have places of worship, including churches and synagogues, where gun violence, you know, is terrorizing us all. You have for young people, um, fertility, which is and decisions about that are against the backdrop of the reversal of Roe v. Wade. You have political divisiveness, climate change, which is really, on the minds of a lot of young adults. All these things are swirling. And then, in a closer to home fashion, we know a lot about aversive childhood events,
Mm,
you
mhm,
and how those things are so young adults, to get back to your question, Erica, young adults who've experienced one or more adversive events in their childhood, including sexual or emotional abuse, even disruption, divorce in the family, having a parent who is mentally ill or a parent who is addicted. All of those things, there's sort of vulnerabilities that kids have, if and especially if those things, if they were diagnosed with ADHD, if they experienced anxiety, separation anxiety, all of those things in their childhood, they're carrying that around. And if it's not addressed, if it wasn't addressed, it affects their ability to kind of navigate all those experimentation pieces. I was thinking about another case of a 20-year-old female who was just a frequent user of Facebook and Instagram, and she wanted, she was, there's great joy in being able to connect with your friends,
mhm,
and to communicate with them. For her, especially as she was moving her first year into college, to be able to stay connected with her family was tre- tremendously satisfying.
mhm,
But then as she moved along, she was like, gosh, everyone's having a good time. My friends, the pictures, it's all about, reinforcing the notion that I'm less than, that I'm not as good looking, I'm not as popular, and no matter what I would say to her as gently as I could say it, well, they're good looking because maybe they got a lot of filtering going on in their pictures, and of course they're not going to be communicating about the times when they too feel down. And they're not, they're not having such a good day. What you're
Right, like
seeing,
I literally have, people say, "Oh, that's a great picture." They're like, "Oh, we literally had an argument 2 minutes before, and there you have the
yeah,
happy family, all smiling in front of the Christmas tree," and so the reality. But I did want to highlight a couple of things that you had said about, that I also see a lot in is like, the thing with the social media is and related to the, alcohol or internet misuse or substance misuse is just the difficulty regulating the use, right? Like the need versus like a want to, being able to stop. And the biggest thing being like using it as an escape, like an escape from not just like issues or reality per se, that too, but also just like their own feelings. Like I see a lot of people, a lot of young adults like having difficulty with distressing emotions and not knowing how to cope. And so they, need to get that external validation on social media. Or, you had mentioned, a bunch of kids, well, I say kids, but like, adolescents and young adults just hanging out, but not really connecting and being present with each other. And so, the lack of like deep or real social connection that's not sticking per se, right, is I feel like makes a lot of these people vulnerable where they're seeking like how many likes or followers or you know um scrolling on dating apps just to get that validation. Oh good, I'm still desirable, but I'm not really interested in dating now, right? But they just needed that. They were feeling in a dark place or they were feeling insecure and they just wanted that validation. And the more, and a lot of times they eventually get to a place where they realize that they're so anxious because their sense of self-worth or esteem or that they matter, right, that
yes,
is that, or they're likable, is that based on external factors or external validation that obviously don't have control over. So um yeah, that's what I've been seeing with the increased need for external validation
yes,
and and lack of distress tolerance, which could drive people into
yes.
a dating sprees or unhealthy, risky sexual behaviors. And that's not so much driven from a place of exploration curiosity, but more as an avoidance of their own emotions or avoidance of being getting like. So it's kind of like that. I always like to say, like, are you running toward or are you running away from? And
Right.
yeah.
You know, as excellent. As a clinician, I think, you're thinking about what's the function of the behavior?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
What,
mm-hmm.
what are you, why are you doing this? What is it getting you? And then you're also thinking about the frequency of it and the duration of it. Those are the variables that I think that you're trying to get the young adult to ask themselves, to guide them through that walk in terms of determining whether this is something that is enhancing their lives or weighing it down. And I think, things like substances are maybe easier too to see. I think let's take marijuana use. I think pot use among young adults has definitely increased, and that's due to several factors, including legalization and a lot of public campaign to uh, you know evidence to suggest some of the positive uses of it for different things. And so that I think it kind of normalizes and encourages the experimentation, the use of it. But I think it's also, we're forgetting evidence, which is data driven and scientific, about the dangers of it. And
Mhm.
particularly if you have, these predisposing kinds of conditions, you have, for example, I think if you have psychosis in your family tree, if you have um, a high concentration, a very potent pot that you're,
Mhm.
and you have this history and you have a neurological, a vulnerable, that's the neurology, the biochemistry of this it's just not, it's just not a positive outcome for it. and I think talking, with uh, uh, the other thing I think is that a lot of times young adults are not too interested. I know I wasn't interested in my family tree. And parents are sometimes not even either willing or wanting because of their own childhood wounds to talk about that history. One client who, like, after her child was diagnosed with bipolarity, she, gosh, that's why my everyone talked about my grandfather and why certain times, you had to walk on eggshells, or why he was so depressed. I think he had bipolar illness, but it was never talked about. He was just this mysterious away from grandpa figure at certain.
And I'm so glad you brought up these points in the last few minutes because with the I did want to kind of touch on the family dynamics and the role of mental health or eating disorders, substance misuse, like the role of these unhealthy coping skills. Because oftentimes, like I see, like it draws out those family secrets, right? Or like nobody asked how I was doing when this uncle or grandfather, right, was acting in this way,
Yeah.
or you know it's almost or sometimes like I've seen where the identified patient, right, whoever has like that severe eating disorder or the alcohol or substance use, but really like there's like other family secrets, or that's like the only time that the family gathers around the young adult or the adolescent because now everybody is coming to visit the hospital, whereas like that's not the case before, so it almost kind of like reinforces the illness in a way. And
Yes.
also the other part that you were saying about parents are also human, so they've got their own, they only know what their experience and upbringing was, and they're just trying to do the best they can. But a lot of times, I tend to see more of that high functioning, high achievers. They're motive, they want to do a good job, but they're very anxious, insecure, even though data and reality based, says otherwise, right? Very
Yeah.
high functioning, but a lot of like anxiety and distress, and a common thing that keeps coming up for people like I guess the silent, silent struggling but strong on the outside, um, is like the things like of I could never talk to my parents, right? Like you were saying, like I never felt heard, or I felt criticized, or oh, I could never talk to them about emotions, right? Because they
Yes.
they also didn't have that emotional validation or emotional how to talk about emotional conversations with their kids, so they
No.
don't know, they have to internalize everything or hold it together, or sometimes they were the good one, right, who did everything by the book, or their other sibling was the one with all the issues and problems, so they didn't want to be the additional burden. They had to stay quiet. They had to not ruffle any feathers, and they had to be the people pleasers, and then eventually they snap, like
Yes.
in their mid late 20s, or finally they're like, I don't even know who I am, right? Like they're depressed because they're living
Yes.
everybody else's lives. They're not, having their own core sense of identity. They don't want to ask for help. They don't want a burden. So that's kind of like
So
what I oftentimes see.
Yes.
so
Exactly.
let's talk about that young adult at that point in time. Here you are. You there is a lot of uncertainty. There are family histories of issues. You are experimenting. Maybe you drank too much alcohol one night. You have a hangover. Maybe you did too much marijuana or too many drugs or whatever the case may be. Um, you want to talk to somebody, or maybe you want to talk to somebody. You may not know how to talk to your
Hmm.
parent. Okay. In many families, not in all, but in many families, you're certainly not going to talk to them about sex. I mean, my God. Well, I mean, you just
Mhm.
probably are not going to bring that up, right? But if you want to talk to somebody, how do you talk to your parent? A, And B, when your parent immediately you know, drops into parent mode as opposed to, wise counsel or anything else, how do you flip them from one mode to the next?
Right, like what can the young adult do to kind of shift
Yeah.
that dynamic? Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Oh, wow. Our book, we're so concentrated on what the parent can do, but what can a young adult do? Um, it's, I guess, all the coaching this is on the other side of it, the coaching for the young adult, to be able to use all the skills interpersonally that we talk about what the parent needs, to be able to use I language, use clear and deliberative communication, to reinforce their own boundaries, their boundaries. These are kind of all skills that I think are difficult for a
Mhm.
young adult to master, let alone the parent. But I think, um, it could be that, I can't talk to. I try and do
Mhm.
the best I can, and I just can't. And then, finding that a mentor, a professor, a therapist, someone, someone who truly has wise counsel. But I'd like to pick therapist and having a therapist be able to, help coach them along for how to speak to their parents about what's going on.
Mhm.
But, you know, I think there's a couple of things. I can't help but think that part of the issues about talking to parents about or not talking to them, about perfectionism, about being the model, the hero in the family, it has to do with the fact that there's a trend, a shift in parenting. And it's become sort of almost a cliche about the helicopter parent.
Mhm.
It really has, but it's a stereotype. But I think there's a grain of truth to the stereotype that parents have had this tendency because they're living in a VUCA world too. And they're scared to death about what happens when their kid goes to school. And, when so they're having a tendency to over
Mhm.
shelter. They're having, everybody is uh, there's no loser in this competition. Everyone wins and gets the prize, that sort of thing. So what is missing, and this has been observed in the literature about the stalled and failure to launch, is this kind of resiliency
Mhm.
in the face of hard times and defeat. Um, that you have to kind of have the experience of falling down and several times before you can get up. You're going to be disappointed. And how do you manage all of that? How do you manage, not getting accepted into your honor society and making it into your first choice college? How do you deal with all of those things and learning how to navigate that? And sometimes parents have to let their kids fail.
Yeah, and then there's like this like learned expectation that somebody else will pick up the pieces, right? The parent
Yeah.
will make a call to the principal or the teacher or the coach or maybe they just do it themselves, like when I was applying to grad schools and stuff, I knew classmates in college whose parents wrote their law school application essays,
Yeah.
so it's like they don't, so there's like an element of like not
Yes.
like not learning, right? They're
Yes.
not learning how to do it themselves and like inadvertently, like, they think they're helping their child, but they're like enabling this like I don't want to call it learned helplessness, but kind of like the sense of like somebody else will do it. I don't have to do it. So why? And then they don't have that motivation to do it themselves or learn it themselves because somebody else will pick up the pieces or, um, they won't let me fail and things like that.
I think that's an excellent point. Dan, just getting back to what you were talking about, I do observe generational differences in terms of help seeking. And I think what I've observed, and maybe because I was teaching abnormal psychology for so many years at the university, there's it's a popular major, and there's those classes are filled with people that are studying themselves and their own family, and they're identifying a lot. People coming up to me, after class saying, "Oh, I think my uncle has bipolar disorder." People, obviously distressed during the class because they're hearing themselves in the lecture. And I think there's a little bit more among some of them, more propensity to want to, learn more, want to go into therapy, or at least to go online. And this is also something that I think can be a dangerous use of the internet. Is there's a lot of sites that give out information and allow people to, this is and it's there's also a plus side to it that allow people to talk with other people that are having similar symptoms. And so all of that can be good, but I see the flip side of it where there's a lot of fixation on the diagnostic label, and a lot of what this it's called nocebo. And Meg Jay talks about this in her book Among 20 Somethings, is the idea where this instead of being a positive thing, this it becomes filled with these negative expectancies and energy and expectations. So I can't do this because I have ADHD, or I'm
Mhm.
bipolar, or, I this disengagement because I just can't, or this feeling of entitlement that also can come from that where you should understand I have ADHD. No, I sort of get it, and I sort of believe in accommodations, but it doesn't give you a free pass in my class. You still, what then? What are you going to do? How are you going to, that's the resiliency part.
Right. And the self-efficacy and
Yeah,
accountability piece. Yeah.
right, right. And I think so, it can have that because I've been with people where it's just every 2 minutes they're bringing up, I have panic disorder, and I'm on these chat groups, and it's just, and it gets hard to get into the intervention, sometimes when all of that is the ghost in the room, so um and I think there are a lot. I mean, I still think there are a lot of people who in this generation and their parents' generation that still are caught in the stigma of mental illness. I just picked up my Monitor, that magazine that I get from the American
Mhm.
Psychological Association yesterday, and another huge survey that they did with the general public, and there's something like a whopping 88% of people say there's no shame in having a mental illness, but then there's 25% that say, well, if I knew somebody that had one, I'd have a different opinion. I'd think differently about the person. So I think there are still substantial, but I feel intuitively like there's still substantial barriers there in terms of aligning mental health and talking about mental health in the same equal fashion that we talk about taking care of your physical health.
Mhm.
Um, Getting, if I could, I know I'm doing a lot of talking here, just one more point. I wanted to say that there's this continuum of mental illness, but then I think there's this continuum that's it's not about an mental illness. It's about the degree to which, it's not, or the absence of mental illness. It's about the degree to which you are happy, satisfied with life,
Mhm.
well respected,
Mhm.
accomplishing things. And the concept that I really like that was introduced by Lawrence Steinberg, who just wrote a book about, he writes a lot about adolescence, but he just wrote a book about young adults. And he's saying, you know, let's look at flourishing and
Mhm.
on this continuum of flourishing versus floundering, you know, and um, what does that look like? You know, it's not just having good physical health, it's good mental health, it's having meaning and purpose, it's the resiliency, all of those things, financial, it's also financial stability, you know, flourishing, and
Mhm.
that helps a lot. Um,
Yeah.
but, you know, so I think maybe with young adults, we and with people at large, maybe, you know, using these concepts a little bit more rather than taking emotions and behaviors that we all have and pathologizing them as we tend to do with the DSM-3. You know, that
Mhm.
volume is getting heftier and heftier as we take, you know, these behaviors that, yeah, I'm depressed, but you know, do I have MDD? You know, I there's a spread of difference, and we need to kind of get grounded there. And I'm sorry, Dan, I know you wanted to say something.
Well, the thing that I want to say is really two things. One is that when you start thinking about mental illness or mental diagnoses, one of those diagnoses is ADHD. It's very, very common, actually. And it can be difficult then to complete tasks, as you were talking about. By the same token, we have to remember that there are many, many happy people out there that have ADHD.
Mhm.
And in addition to that, there are many, many super successful people
Yeah.
that have ADHD. I believe Elon Musk is supposed to have ADHD. I believe Bill Gates is supposed to have ADHD. There are successful actors and musicians and others in our popular life that we know of that have ADHD. The same is probably true about anxiety and depression. And occasionally you'll actually hear about musicians talking about, oh, I had a bout of depression or I had a bout of anxiety and they got through it. And usually they'll get through it with some amount of help. So we shouldn't necessarily assume that having a diagnosis or even getting a diagnosis is a bad thing. It actually can help us because then it can give us the tools to deal with it. So I believe there is more acceptance. I think we should understand that it is not a complete barrier. It's not a complete roadblock to happiness. We can get around that roadblock. That said, when I think about the young adult, everything that's going on in their heads, all the changes that are occurring, trying to negotiate the difference between having your parent be a parent as opposed to being someone that I can talk to, having to potentially reaching out to therapists or reaching out to friends. One of the things that becomes pretty clear is that um, the the young adult, the person that the person that's having all these feelings that wants to talk really needs to be able to evaluate who it is that they want to talk
Mhm.
about, what, right?
Mhm.
And making that judgment is a difficult thing. Can you talk just very briefly about how they should distinguish, whether they should be talking about um, you know, not being able to concentrate with their friends or their professor or their therapist or their parent? Like, how do you differentiate that? When should they talk to who?
So perfect that you said what you said in terms of the positive role models. Um, I think schizophrenia is probably the most debilitating and serious mental illnesses. And Alan Sachs, who wrote The Center Cannot Hold, or Will Not Hold, I guess. And she did a TED talk. I always play that in my class because she's, a brilliant attorney and has done more than I would ever dream possible to inspire people. So I just want to kind of compliment you and reinforce what you said. Your first point, and then your second point, I think, was really on target too. I think one of the really difficult things for young people, for all, and old, is to accept that sometimes the very people we love can't give us what we want. And I
Mm,
think what we're looking for when we have issues with depression, any kind of mental health problem, we're looking for unconditional support. And I think that, there are, in many cases, very unfortunately, sometimes parents who can't provide that. Their own issues and personalities, life experiences get in the way of that. And I think as a
There's no,
therapist, yeah,
there's nothing wrong with that.
yeah. And I think as a therapist, it's kind of like you can't get water from a stone, that old expression. It's sometimes to encourage, your psychological safety here is dependent of you. You don't need to hear those damning messages. And your ability to discriminate, like who's a person that is going to affirm you, no matter who you are, no matter how you behave, really, what you do. And I think, sometimes people do have sort of a radar for that.
mm,
Like I know because um some of the students who, they were not my clients would come in and ask me for counseling
mm,
because they had a radar for, you know, who's going to accept me? It's okay. This is part of the human condition we're talking
mm,
about. And there's nothing you can tell me that is going to repel me. You know, Even having clients who are sexual abusers, not being repelled, and that's really important. Um, Very important for the psyche, and I think, and Dan, I strongly believe that that kind of unconditional support and care is comes from a human being. I think one of the things about the chat box story is that that chat box, might have said, "Here's your hotline number." Might have said that many times, as is reported in that particular case of, I think his name is Rain. His last name is Rain, Adam Rain. You know, but it breaks down over time because you know in your heart of heart, that person doesn't it's not a human being and it doesn't care about you.
mm,
And in that case, it turned on a dime and gave that young person advice about how to kill himself and write a suicide note. That's a horror story. But I think you get my central point here about being able to evaluate that. And you know and I think, I also think, um this maybe sounds like I'm passing the buck, but I also strongly feel like the onus is also on the parent. I think that saying to a young person, as much as you want to see your parent change, the onus is on them to provide the climate that is necessary for um, young people to be able to be themselves. And I think with parents, there's my two co-writers are parents of young adults, and the onus for the parent is the idea that your young adult is not mini me. You're not living your life through them. And these things have to be internalized, and conscious awful lot to be able to respond to, a young adult, a child, the way you might respond to a coworker. Because maybe the coworker at work tells you the same story, but you're not going to turn around and yell and scream.
So let me just say that um, I have 5 children, and they're adults. But I've always told people that every child is different, and they're different virtually from birth. And so we all have to recognize that, and we have to deal with them slightly differently, even though they're brought up in the same household by the same parents, et cetera, et cetera. So your point is well taken. In some, it's easier to have that um, coach or wise counsel discussion with, or peer conversation with. Others, it's a little bit more difficult. You kind of got to work into it, but it is possible, and it is something that we both need to work at, both as young adults and as parents. But with that, I want to be respectful of time, and I want to give each of you 1 minute to summarize. Erica, anything that you would like to say to us?
Oh no, I think this is a great discussion. I really appreciated you and all your insights, very interesting points, and definitely about, I think like to summarize like the last points that you were making, like identifying, for the young adult to identify like your needs, like what are you needing? So then who's the best person who's gonna be able to provide that, because if it is it just like practical problem solving advice, or is it more emotional validation and support and just being themselves, right? And that could be two different people, and they may not be your parents or they may be your parents. Um, so yes, that's all I wanted to say. And yeah.
I
Lynn, you've got one.
Good summary points. Something to add to that mix is that mentor, wise counsel, not a therapist, but the mentor, the wise counsel, some adult, an aunt or an uncle, um, let them help you as a young adult. Let them guide you into treatment. Because I think right now, this mental health care system is a complex maze. And being 2021 and struggling doesn't always equip you, and the lack of executive, functioning, administrative skills don't always uh, position you to make good decisions about who to see and what's available, and knowing when someone prescribes a medication that you really do have to internalize and understand what the side effects are, because we're seeing a lot of over medication and overdiagnosis. And in often cases, we're seeing it by people who are GPs, and I have nothing against GPs, but I think you break your arm, you see an orthopedist. The people sometimes with the most skill need to get in touch with you and to see you and to evaluate you, the people with the experience. So I just wanted to add that little piece at the end.
I appreciate that. Let me conclude by saying that our sponsor today is Equilibria Psychological and Consultation Services, whose mission is to help individuals achieve their personal potential, long-term growth by compassionately and respectfully helping clients live in balance. Visit equilibriapcs.com, equilibriapcs.com. You can look for them on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You can also look for me on Instagram, Daniel J. Gomez 24, and on LinkedIn. Now for the disclaimer. I am not a medical professional and I am not providing medical advice. The opinion of our speakers is solely their own. This podcast is copyrighted and cannot be reproduced without the express written consent of EPCS Management, LLC.